Hey guys, tonight we step into a world the ancient Egyptians knew well. A land where the Nile didn't just bring life, but also things that could absolutely ruin your day. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy wandering through history with me. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before Egypt became the land of endless sand, dramatic sunsets and tourists slowly melting under the sun, it was something far less expected, alive, green, and frankly, a little chaotic. The early landscape of Egypt, especially before and during the first dynasties, looked less like a desert and more like a place where you would absolutely not want to wander off alone. The Sahara had not yet embraced its destiny as a giant sandbox. Instead, it was a mix of grasslands, wetlands, and seasonal lakes, the kind of environment that supports life and all the problems that come with it. Rainfall was more generous, the Nile flooded with reliable enthusiasm, and the surrounding land supported a wide range of animals, not small polite animals, large ones, the kind that make eye contact with you and you immediately reconsider your life choices. To the people living there, this wasn't some rare golden age. This was just Tuesday. Herds moved across open plains that are now completely empty, aside from the occasional confused lizard wondering where everything went. The Nile wasn't a lonely ribbon of water cutting through silence. It was the center of a busy, noisy ecosystem, filled with movement, sound, and the constant reminder that you were not at the top of the food chain. And this is where things get interesting, because where there is water, there are animals. And where there are animals, there are other animals that specialize in eating those animals. And sometimes, when schedules align, they also eat you. The early Egyptians didn't observe nature from a safe distance. There were no documentaries, no slow-motion shots, no reassuring narrator explaining that everything would be fine. There was just direct, ongoing interaction with a world that did not particularly care whether you survived the day. You fetch water, something might be watching you. You walk through tall grass, something is definitely watching you. You hear nothing at all, that's worse. And yet this was normal life. No one was standing around saying, I think this ecosystem might collapse in a few thousand years. They were too busy not being trampled, bitten, or generally inconvenienced by wildlife. But slowly, very slowly, things began to change. The rains became less reliable. The lakes started shrinking. The green land pulled back inch by inch, like it had somewhere else to be. Animals began to move away, following water that no longer stayed put. Predators followed them, because that's how this works. Nobody sticks around when the food leaves. What remained was the Nile, still flowing, still dependable, but now surrounded by a landscape that was becoming harsher, drier, and significantly less welcoming. The Egypt we imagine today didn't appear overnight. It arrived gradually as the last traces of that earlier world faded away. One animal leaves, then another, and eventually all that's left is sand. And a very long list of things that used to live there, which, as it turns out, is exactly what we're about to explore. There was a time when the idea of elephants in Egypt was not strange, exotic, or the result of a very confused caravan. They were simply there. Long before the desert tightened its grip, elephants roamed parts of northern Africa that are now completely inhospitable. They moved along the Nile and across nearby grasslands, feeding, travelling, and doing what elephants do best, quietly reminding everything else that size is a perfectly valid survival strategy. To the early Egyptians, this was not a spectacle, it was part of the environment. Imagine going to collect water and seeing a herd of elephants in the distance. Not a once-in-a-lifetime event. Just something you'd mention casually later, like bad weather. Oh, the river's a bit crowded today. Elephants again. These weren't the slightly romanticized creatures we think of now, peacefully walking under golden sunsets. They were massive, unpredictable, and entirely capable of turning a calm day into a historical incident. And yet, they existed alongside human settlements, sharing the same water sources, the same land, and occasionally the same level of mutual suspicion. Over time, elephants began to appear in Egyptian art and artifacts, though often in a more symbolic or distant way. By the time Egyptian civilization reached its more recognizable form, elephants were already becoming less common in the region, not because they suddenly lost interest, but because the environment was changing. The rains weakened, the vegetation thinned, water sources became less reliable, and elephants, being many things but not foolish, started to move south, following the resources they needed to survive. It wasn't a dramatic disappearance, no sudden vanishing, just a slow, steady retreat. One generation sees them often, the next sees them occasionally, the next hears stories about them, and eventually they're gone. Humans, of course, helped accelerate this process. Hunting played its part, as it tends to do whenever humans discover large animals with valuable resources attached to them. Ivory alone made elephants a target, and as their numbers declined, their presence in Egypt became less of a reality and more of a memory. What remains today are traces, carvings, references, and the occasional piece of evidence that suggests quite clearly that elephants once walked where now there is only heat and silence. It's easy to think of Egypt as timeless, unchanging, but the elephants would disagree. If they were still around, which, for fairly obvious reasons, they are not. Before cattle became the calm, mildly judgmental creatures you see standing in fields today, they had a far less approachable ancestor, the aurochs. And yes, the ancient Egyptians knew them well. Brink. Food became less abundant, territories more limited, and survival more difficult. But the bigger problem, as usual, was humans. Hunting pressure increased, habitat decreased, and the aurochs, despite their size and strength, could not outpace both at the same time. They didn't disappear overnight. Like many of the animals on this list, their presence faded gradually. Fewer sightings. Smaller herds, then none. Eventually, the aurochs went completely extinct, not just in Egypt, but everywhere. The last known individual died in Europe in the 17th century, which is both surprisingly recent and slightly embarrassing for humanity. Today, all that remains are bones, depictions, and the modern cattle that carry a distant echo of what they once were. A calmer version, a smaller version, a version that no longer has the option to charge you. If you imagine the Nile as a calm, reflective river where people quietly collect water while birds chirp in the background, you are thinking of a version heavily edited for tourism. The ancient Nile was different. It had hippos, not the soft, cartoonish kind that look like they should be wearing a bow tie and offering tea. Real hippos, large, territorial, and deeply committed to violence as a lifestyle choice. To the ancient Egyptians, hippos were not rare. They were everywhere along the Nile and its marshes, especially in earlier periods when water levels were higher and vegetation was abundant. Farmers, fishermen, and basically anyone who needed access to the river had to share space with an animal that could overturn boats, destroy crops, and end your day with alarming efficiency, which it occasionally did. Hippos were responsible for real damage. They trampled fields, devoured vegetation, and disrupted irrigation, which, in a civilization that depended entirely on agriculture, was less of an inconvenience and more of a serious problem. Imagine spending months growing crops only for a large aquatic tank to walk in at night and eat everything like it owns the place. Because from its perspective, it does. Naturally, the Egyptians hunted them, not casually, and definitely not alone. Hunting hippos required coordination, planning, and a healthy acceptance that things could go wrong very quickly. Tomb paintings show groups of men in boats, armed with spears, attempting to bring down these animals in the water, which, strategically speaking, is where the hippo has a slight advantage. Despite the risks, hippo hunting became both a necessity and a symbol. Pharaohs were often depicted participating in these hunts, presenting themselves as protectors of order, defeating chaos, which in this case happened to weigh several tons and bite through wood. There was also a deeper layer of meaning. The hippo became associated with disorder and destruction in Egyptian belief, sometimes linked to the god Set, a figure representing chaos and conflict. Killing a hippo wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. You weren't just saving your crops, you were restoring balance to the universe. No pressure. Over time, however, hippos began to disappear from Egypt. As the climate dried and the Nile's ecosystem changed, their habitats shrank. Increased human activity, hunting, and expanding agriculture pushed them further south, away from the increasingly crowded riverbanks. Eventually, they vanished from Egypt entirely. Today, hippos still exist, just not there. They remain one of the most dangerous animals in Africa, which is both impressive and slightly reassuring, because at least some things haven't changed. But in ancient Egypt, they weren't something you saw on a documentary. They were something you tried not to see at all. Before lions became decorative statues outside hotels and mildly intimidating logos, they were very real residents of ancient Egypt, and they had no interest in symbolism. They lived along the Nile Valley and in the surrounding regions, especially during earlier, greener periods. These were not occasional visitors wandering in from somewhere else. They were part of the ecosystem, moving through the same landscapes as humans, watching the same herds, and occasionally making decisions that were extremely inconvenient for anyone nearby. To the Egyptians, lions were both familiar and deeply respected, which is a polite way of saying they understood exactly what lions were capable of. Unlike hippos, which attacked out of territorial irritation, lions operated with a different kind of logic. They hunted, they observed, they chose their moments, and while humans were not their preferred prey, they were certainly an option on a bad day. Naturally, this made lions powerful symbols. They became associated with strength, kingship, and divine authority. Pharaohs were often depicted hunting lions, which served a clear purpose, demonstrating control over one of the most formidable predators in the region. If you can defeat a lion, the message goes, you can probably handle political problems as well. A bold assumption, but visually effective. Some rulers even kept lions in captivity, which sounds impressive, until you remember that keeping a lion nearby is essentially committing to a long-term arrangement with something that could end that arrangement at any time. Still, the symbolism stuck. Lion imagery appeared in statues, carvings, and protective figures. The famous Sphinx, with its lion's body, reflects this connection, combining human intelligence with animal power, which in theory sounds reassuring. In practice, it suggests you now have twice the problem. But like many animals on this list, lions did not remain in Egypt forever. As the climate changed and the environment became drier, their natural habitat began to shrink. Prey animals became less abundant, and human populations expanded, pushing lions further away from the Nile and into less populated regions. And then came hunting. Lions were not just feared, they were actively pursued, for sport, for protection, and for royal prestige. Over time, this pressure reduced their numbers significantly. The lions that once roamed Egypt were likely part of what we now call the Barbary lion, a subspecies that is now extinct in the wild. By the time later historical records appear, lions had already become rare in Egypt. Then they disappeared entirely. Today, lions still exist, but not there. The Nile no longer echoes with their presence. No tracks, no roars, no quiet movement through tall grass that no longer grows. Only statues remain, which, to be fair, are significantly easier to deal with. If lions represented power and hippos represented chaos, crocodiles represented something far more unsettling: patience. The Nile crocodile was one of the most constant presences in ancient Egypt. While other animals came and went as the climate shifted, crocodiles remained, adapting quietly, watching from the water with the kind of stillness that suggests something unpleasant is about to happen. And usually it was. To the Egyptians, crocodiles were not just dangerous, they were unavoidable. The Nile was the centre of life. It provided water, food, transport, and survival itself. Unfortunately, it also provided crocodiles with a convenient buffet system. Fetching water? Risky. Fishing? Also risky. Existing near the river? You see the pattern. Crocodiles didn't chase. They waited, and when they acted, it was fast, efficient,